Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Wichita Mountains region. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The wind carries memories across the plains of southwestern Oklahoma. In the shadow of the ancient Wichita Mountains, where granite peaks rise like weathered sentinels from the earth, there exists a chronicle so deeply unsettling that many historical records have been sealed, archived, or simply lost to time. What I'm about to share with you comes from documents recovered from abandoned government buildings, fragmented tribal accounts, and journals found buried beneath the floorboards of an old trading post near present-day Fort Sill. In 1840, when Oklahoma was still designated as Indian Territory, the Wichita Mountains stood as silent witnesses to events that would forever haunt this region. The year was pivotal, a time when the Comanche, known as Numunu in their own language, and often called Lords of the Plains by settlers and other tribes alike, had reached the zenith of their power in the southern plains. They had secured peace with the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho to their north that very year, freeing them to focus their formidable military prowess elsewhere. The Comanche were not a unified nation, but consisted of several autonomous bands, each with their own territories and leadership. The Eastern Katsateca Band, the Buffalo Eaters, controlled much of what is now western Oklahoma. They were horsemen without equal, warriors of exceptional skill, and possessed a complex spiritual system centered around what they called puha, personal power that could be obtained from the spirit world. Against this backdrop, in the cold winter of 1840, a trader named Jebediah Atwater established a small outpost at the eastern edge of the Wichita Mountains. The outpost was situated in a narrow valley with unusual acoustics, where sounds carried strangely in the wind, sometimes amplified, sometimes swallowed entirely by the surrounding hills. Atwater's journals, recovered some 30 years later, described his first impressions of the place. The valley seems to breathe at night. The air moves in ways unlike any natural wind I've known. The local guides refuse to stay past sundown, claiming the mountains themselves listen to our conversations. Atwater had come west from Arkansas with ambitions of establishing trade relations with the various tribal nations in the territory. He brought with him 3 assistants: Solomon Reed, a former military scout, Nathaniel Webb, a young man seeking fortune on the frontier, and Hiram Voss, an interpreter who claimed to speak several tribal languages. What's peculiar about these men is that government records show only Atwater had proper documentation for Indian Territory travel. The others appear in no official capacity. By February 1840, Atwater's trading post had attracted attention from both settlers and tribal traders. His ledgers, partially preserved despite water damage, showed exchanges with Wichita, Kiowa, and occasional Comanche visitors. But it was on March 12, 1840, that the first troubling entry appears. Atwater wrote, "S.R. returned from the western slope today, visibly shaken, claims to have found something in the high caves, refuses to elaborate, but has not touched food since return. The sound of distant drums carried through the valley all night." Macabre. What Solomon Reed found in those caves would become the catalyst for everything that followed. According to later statements given by Nathaniel Webb to military authorities at Fort Gibson in 1846, Reed had discovered a natural chamber high in the mountains containing unusual markings on the walls and several artifacts of unknown origin. Among these was a stone vessel sealed with what appeared to be beeswax and sinew. Against the warnings of their Wichita guide, Reed brought this vessel back to the trading post. The following week shows a disturbing progression in Atwater's journal. His handwriting, previously meticulous and orderly, becomes increasingly erratic. He notes unusual behavior among his men, H.V., stands outside at night, facing the mountains, mumbling in a language I cannot identify, not Comanche, not Kiowa, nothing I've heard before. SR continues to lose weight, his eyes sunken, claims to hear voices emanating from the vessel. I've locked it away in the storage cellar. By late March, a Comanche delegation visited the trading post, led by a war chief named Mukwuru. They came not to trade but specifically to inquire about items removed from the mountains. Atwater's journal entry that day reveals his growing paranoia. The Comanche knew about the vessel without being told. How is this possible? They requested its return to the sacred caves immediately. M spoke perfect English, though I was told he had never encountered white men before. His eyes never blinked during our entire conversation. I denied having anything from the caves. The delegation left without incident, but Atwater noted an older member of the group, a medicine man he referred to only as the Ancient One, remained behind momentarily, drawing something in the dust outside the trading post before departing. Atwater copied the symbol into his journal, a spiral pattern with 5 lines radiating outward like spokes. Below it he wrote, HV says this is a warning symbol. The number 5 holds sacred power to the Comanche. April brought unseasonable storms to the region. Atwater's journal becomes increasingly difficult to follow as he begins writing entries at all hours, often in the middle of the night. The wind speaks now. Reed can hear it too. Names from long ago, places that no longer exist. The vessel in the cellar emits a low hum that vibrates through the floorboards. Webb attempted to leave yesterday but returned after nightfall, disoriented, claiming the paths kept returning him to the trading post. Distance has become unreliable. On April 17, 1840, a military patrol from Fort Gibson, led by Lieutenant Cassius Montgomery, stopped at the trading post while surveying the region. Montgomery's official report, filed upon his return to the fort, noted the peculiar atmosphere of the outpost and the unwell appearance of the 4 men. He described Atwater as feverish and distracted, Voss as unnaturally calm and watching the mountains constantly, Reed as emaciated and possibly suffering from consumption, and Webb as nervous to the point of constant trembling. Montgomery also reported that during their overnight stay he was awakened by a sound like many voices speaking in whispers that seemed to come from beneath the trading post. When he inquired about it the next morning, Atwater denied hearing anything and quickly changed the subject. The patrol departed the following day, and this would be the last documented outside contact with the trading post for nearly 2 months. Atwater's journal entries for late April become shorter but more disturbing. The Ancient One visits in dreams now, shows me things beneath the mountains, chambers that should not exist, passages that lead to places not of this world. HV has begun carving symbols into his forearms, says it keeps the voices out. The vessel's seal is degrading. Something seeps from it, not liquid, not gas, but something between states. On May 3rd, a significant entry appears, riders on the horizon today, not military, not settlers. Comanche War Party led by M. They made no approach but watched the outpost from dawn until dusk before departing. SR insists we break open the vessel now, claims what's inside will protect us. NW threatened to destroy it instead. Found him sleepwalking toward the cellar at midnight. Had to physically restrain him. The entries become increasingly fragmented through mid-May. Atwater writes of hearing music without instruments coming from the mountains at night. He describes the air inside the trading post as thick and difficult to breathe, and claims that shadows move independently of their casters. Most disturbing is his description of time becoming slippery, moments stretching into hours, hours condensing into seconds. The last dated entry in Atwater's journal is May 28, 1840. They are coming tonight. The Ancient One told me in my dreams. not to harm us, but to contain what we've unleashed. SR opened the vessel this morning, nothing inside but dust, nothing visible at least. But the air shimmered around it like heat above a fire. HV began speaking in that language again, but this time, God help me, I understood every word. We have torn the veil between worlds. The Comanche have kept this contained for generations, their most sacred duty, and we, in our ignorance and greed, have broken the seal. The journal ends there. What happened to Atwater and his men remained unknown until July 1840, when a larger military expedition, led by Colonel Matthias Goodnight, arrived at the trading post location during a survey of potential sites for a permanent fort in the region. Goodnight's report describes finding the trading post completely abandoned, with no sign of violence or struggle. Personal belongings, trading goods, and supplies remained in place. Food sat on plates, partially consumed. A single set of footprints led from the building toward the mountains, but strangely, they were described as unnaturally spaced, as if the person was taking impossibly long strides. The mystery of what happened at Atwater's trading post might have been forgotten entirely if not for events that unfolded 7 years later. In 1847, as white settlement in the region increased, a surveyor named William Densore led a small team to map portions of the Wichita Mountains. Densore kept meticulous field notes, which eventually found their way to the Oklahoma Historical Society archives in 1902. On August 14, 1847, Densore's team encountered a small group of Comanche led by a warrior he identified as Standing Smoke. Through an interpreter, Standing Smoke warned them away from a particular valley on the eastern slope of the mountains, the same location where Atwater's trading post had stood. The structure itself was gone by this time, with no trace of its foundations remaining. According to Densore's notes, Standing Smoke explained that the area was taboo, forbidden ground, that the Comanche had been protecting for generations. He spoke of ancient powers that slept beneath the mountains, entities that existed before humans walked the earth. The Comanche's sacred duty was to ensure these powers remained dormant. Standing Smoke referenced four who had awakened what should not be awakened, and how the tribe had been forced to make a terrible choice to contain the breach. Densore, a man of scientific mindset, dismissed these warnings as superstition. He noted with condescension that Standing Smoke spoke with such conviction that his men clearly believed every word of this primitive fantasy. Against the Comanche's warnings, Densore led his team into the valley the next day to continue their survey. What they found there defies conventional explanation. Densore's field notes, written in his typically precise hand, describe entering the valley around midday under clear skies. The air grew suddenly still, he wrote. No bird sounds, no insect noise. The very atmosphere seemed to press against our skin with unusual density. Tompkins, one of his surveyors, complained of hearing whispers, though none of us were speaking. As they proceeded deeper into the valley, Densore noted an unusual phenomenon. The mountains on either side appeared to shift position when not directly observed. I would take a compass reading of a distinct peak, then look away momentarily, only to find upon looking back that the peak had seemingly relocated several degrees from its previous position. The team discovered a circular clearing where vegetation refused to grow. The bare earth was arranged in a perfect circle, approximately 30 feet in diameter. At its center stood a crude stone marker, weathered but clearly fashioned by human hands. Densore noted that the stone bore markings similar to Comanche pictographs, but of a style I have not encountered before, more angular, more precise. As the team began measuring and documenting the site, Densore recorded that his men began to experience intense discomfort. Palmer developed a sudden nosebleed that would not stop. Tompkins complained of a high-pitched tone that only he could hear. Matthews began speaking rapidly in what he later claimed was not a language he knew. Densmore himself reported feeling a profound sense of being watched from all directions simultaneously. The most disturbing account came as the team prepared to leave before sundown. Densmore wrote, "As we gathered our equipment, I observed what appeared to be human figures standing motionless among the distant trees and rock formations. Each time I attempted to focus directly on one of these figures, it would no longer be there, yet in my peripheral vision they seemed to have moved closer. I counted at least 4 distinct silhouettes. The rational part of my mind suggests these were shadows cast by the setting sun, yet they seemed to move independent of the light's direction." The team hastily departed the valley. That night, camped several miles away, Densmore reported that all 4 men experienced the same dream. They were standing in the circular clearing while 4 figures approached from the cardinal directions. The figures had the general shape of men, but moved in ways that seemed fluid and wrong, as if their joints bent in unnatural directions. In the dream, the stone marker at the center of the clearing spoke to them in a voice that Densmore described as neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow all of these simultaneously. By morning, Palmer's condition had worsened. His nosebleed had stopped, but he complained of intense pain behind his eyes. Tompkins could no longer hear the high-pitched tone, but instead reported periods of total deafness, alternating with moments of hypersensitive hearing. Matthews appeared normal but refused to speak at all. Densmore decided to abandon the survey and return to the nearest settlement. They never made it. Densmore alone arrived at the military camp at Cache Creek 3 days later, disoriented and feverish. He could not account for what happened to his men, nor explain the missing days. Military physician Dr. Emmanuel Hayward treated Densmore and kept notes on his condition, describing him as suffering from acute sensory disturbances and temporal disorientation. Densmore insisted only a few hours had passed since leaving the valley, despite evidence to the contrary. During his convalescence, Densmore spoke repeatedly about the 4 who came before and the 4 who opened the way. He drew the same spiral symbol with 5 radiating lines that Atwater had copied into his journal 7 years earlier. Dr. Hayward noted that Densmore would sometimes carry on conversations with invisible presences, addressing them by the names Atwater, Reed, Voss, and Webb. Densmore recovered physically but was described as permanently altered in temperament. He abandoned his surveying career and spent his remaining years as a recluse in a small cabin near present-day Medicine Park. Local accounts from the early 1850s describe him as obsessively covering his walls with drawings of the Wichita Mountains from various angles, always with 4 silhouetted figures placed somewhere in the landscape. The connection between Atwater's trading post and Densmore's experience remained undiscovered until 1902, when historian Ambrose Bierce, who would himself mysteriously disappear in Mexico a decade later, happened upon both accounts while researching frontier settlements in Indian Territory. Bierce's unpublished notes draw explicit connections between the 2 incidents and suggest something profound occurred in that valley in the spring of 1840. Bierce managed to track down military records indicating that in June 1840, between the disappearance of Atwater's group and Colonel Goodnight's discovery of the abandoned trading post, a significant gathering of Comanche had been observed in the Wichita Mountains, estimated at over 200 warriors from multiple bands. This gathering was unusual as it occurred outside the normal seasonal patterns of Comanche movement and involved bands that typically operated independently. The military observers, maintaining distance, reported that the Comanche appeared to be conducting an elaborate ceremony centered around a specific valley for 4 days and nights. The observers noted constant drumming in the light of fires, though the activities themselves were obscured by the terrain. On the 5th day, the gathering dispersed rapidly, with bands returning to their traditional territories. What ritual the Comanche performed there remains undocumented in any official capacity. However, Bierce uncovered a partial account from Luther Standing Bear, a mixed-blood interpreter who claimed his father had been present at the gathering. According to this second-hand account, the ceremony was called the Binding of Shadows, and was performed only in the most dire circumstances, when certain boundaries had been breached. Standing Bear's account, as related by Bierce, claimed that 4 outsiders had opened a door that must remain closed and released entities that existed in the space between moments. These entities could not be destroyed, but could be bound through specific rituals involving the willing sacrifice of personal power, or puha, by many medicine men working in concert. The most unsettling aspect of Standing Bear's account was his description of the 4 outsiders' ultimate fate. According to the story, they had not died in any conventional sense, but had been woven into the binding, becoming part of the seal that would contain what they had released. He described them as existing in a state that was neither life nor death, but eternal watchfulness. Is this what happened to Atwater and his men? Were they somehow incorporated into a Comanche spiritual ritual to contain forces they had unwittingly unleashed? The historical record offers no definitive answers, only disturbing implications. In 1934, during the construction of a road near the eastern edge of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 6 feet below the surface. Inside was a collection of personal items: a pocket watch, a carved wooden pipe, a small leather-bound book that had deteriorated beyond readability, and a sealed glass vial containing what appeared to be dark sand or dust. The items were sent to the University of Oklahoma for analysis. The pocket watch bore the inscription J. Atwater, 1838, on its inner case. The pipe was identified as likely belonging to someone of Northern European descent based on its design. The vial's contents were analyzed and found to contain ordinary sand mixed with an unidentified organic compound that the technology of the time could not properly assess. Perhaps most significant was what happened to these artifacts afterward. University records indicate they were placed in storage pending further study, but in 1935, a small fire broke out in the precise section of the building where they were kept. Though quickly contained, the fire destroyed only the box and its contents, despite being surrounded by other highly flammable materials that remained untouched by the flames. The valley itself, whose exact location has been obscured in most historical accounts, is believed to lie somewhere within what is now the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. Established in 1901, the refuge encompasses more than 59 of 100 acres of ancient mountains and mixed-grass prairie. Park rangers and wildlife management personnel have occasionally reported unusual phenomena in certain areas, particularly a section in the eastern portion that somehow never appears consistently on maps drawn by different surveyors. In 1963, refuge manager Harold Winters documented a strange occurrence while conducting a routine wildlife survey in a remote valley. His field notes describe entering an area where the air became noticeably still and heavy, and where he experienced a profound sense of being observed from all directions. Winters noted that his compass began rotating continuously, making navigation impossible. Most notably, he reported encountering 4 distinct human silhouettes standing motionless among distant rocks, which he initially assumed were other park personnel until he realized they never moved, yet seemed to be in different positions each time he looked away and back again. Winters cut his survey short and left the area. In his official report, he described the experience as likely resulting from light and shadow effects, combined with isolation fatigue. However, in personal correspondence discovered after his death in 1976, he admitted to colleagues that he continued to have dreams about the four figures for years afterward. In these dreams, they would approach him silently, their features never quite visible, and speak in unison without moving their lips. Their message always the same: we watch, we contain, we endure. The most recent documented strange occurrence in the region comes from 1995, when a graduate student in anthropology, Marisa Connley, was conducting research on historical land use patterns in the Wichita Mountains. While examining survey maps from different periods, she noticed a peculiar anomaly. A specific valley appeared in slightly different locations on maps drawn in different eras, as if the geography itself was shifting over time. Intrigued, Connley attempted to locate this valley using modern GPS equipment. Her research journal, submitted as part of her unfinished thesis, describes 3 failed attempts to reach the location. Each time she would find herself walking in circles, despite following precise coordinates. On her 4th attempt, accompanied by a local guide, she reported successfully entering the valley, but experiencing immediate disorientation. Her journal entry, dated April 17, 1995, reads, "The mountains seem to bend around us. Distance is impossible to judge accurately. Jim, her guide, keeps checking his watch, insisting it's running too slowly. There's a feeling here like static electricity against the skin, but stronger, more pervasive." Connley described finding a clearing where vegetation grew in an unusual circular pattern. At its center lay several weathered stones arranged in a spiral pattern with 5 lines extending outward. She took photographs and soil samples before departing as the afternoon waned. Her journal's final entry that day notes, "As we left, I glanced back and saw what appeared to be 4 people watching us from the ridgeline. Jim didn't see them. When I raised my camera, they were gone." The photos later showed nothing but empty ridge. The soil samples Connley collected showed unusual properties when tested, including paramagnetic qualities not typically found in Oklahoma soil compositions and trace elements that couldn't be immediately identified. Before further analysis could be completed, however, the samples were reported missing from the university laboratory where they were being stored. Connley never returned to the valley to collect additional samples. Her thesis advisor noted that she became increasingly withdrawn in the weeks following her visit, eventually taking a leave of absence from her studies. University records indicate she never returned to complete her degree. Attempts by later researchers to contact her have been unsuccessful. What are we to make of these accounts spanning more than 150 years? Are they merely the product of isolation, suggestion, and the human tendency to create patterns from random events? Or do they point to something more profound, a mystery at the heart of the Wichita Mountains that defies conventional explanation? The Comanche people, who once controlled this region through their unmatched skill as warriors and horsemen, treated these mountains with profound spiritual respect. Their concept of puha, personal power that could be obtained from the spirit world, was centered around specific sacred sites, many of which were in the Wichita Range. Their oral traditions, much of which has been lost to time, and the cultural disruption of forced relocation, spoke of boundaries between worlds and the responsibility to maintain these boundaries. In 1898, as an elderly Comanche man, identified only as White Wolf, was being interviewed by a field researcher from the Smithsonian Institution, he made a cryptic reference to 4 who watch from the shadows in the Wichita Mountains. When pressed for clarification, he reportedly grew agitated and refused to speak further on the subject, saying only, "Some doors must remain closed, some stories must remain untold. The binding holds, but only if we honor it with silence." That silence has largely been maintained in official records. Military documents, survey reports, and academic studies all show curious gaps when it comes to certain areas within the Wichita Mountains. Even today, sections of the wildlife refuge remain restricted, ostensibly for conservation purposes. rangers rotate assignments frequently, with none assigned to certain sectors for more than a few weeks at a time. Is there something in those ancient granite peaks that defies our understanding of reality? Did Jebediah Atwater and his men stumble upon forces beyond human comprehension? And did the Comanche, with their deep spiritual connection to the land, perform a ritual that somehow contained these forces at great cost, a binding that incorporated the very men who had broken the original seal? The historical record offers no definitive answers, but even today, visitors to the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge occasionally report unusual experiences: compasses that spin without reason, GPS devices that show impossible locations, the feeling of being watched when no one is present. Some speak of seeing 4 distant figures on the horizon who vanish when approached. Others describe dreams of a voice that speaks from stone, telling of doors between worlds and the price of keeping them closed. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps some knowledge is safer, left undisturbed. As White Wolf suggested, some stories must remain untold, honored only with silence. And yet the wind still carries whispers across the plains of southwestern Oklahoma. In the shadow of those ancient mountains, something waits, something watches, something remembers. And sometimes in the perfect stillness of night, if you listen carefully near certain valleys in the eastern range, you might hear what sounds like 4 voices, speaking in unison, not quite human, not quite spirit, repeating the same phrase over and over. We watch, we contain, we endure. Honor, or lespe. But what I've shared thus far is merely the foundation of a much deeper mystery, one that stretches back further than the Atwater incident, and continues to manifest in ways that defy rational explanation. The Comanche themselves were not the first to recognize the unusual properties of the eastern Wichita Mountains. Archaeological evidence suggests that earlier peoples, possibly ancestors of the Wichita tribe, established seasonal ceremonial sites in specific valleys, always oriented toward certain peaks in a pattern that corresponds to celestial alignments during the winter solstice. These sites date back at least 500 years, and all were deliberately abandoned sometime in the early 1700s. Around the same time, the Comanche were establishing dominance in the region. Spanish explorers in the late 17th century, led by Diego del Castillo, documented unusual phenomena in the area while searching for rumored gold deposits. Del Castillo's journals, preserved in archives in Mexico City, describe a valley where the compass needle spins without purpose and where men hear voices calling their names, though no speakers are present. He noted that his indigenous guides refused to enter certain ravines, claiming that those who slept there awakened, changed, speaking of places that do not exist and times that have not yet come to pass. The Comanche, upon establishing control of the region, quickly identified these same areas as spiritually significant. Unlike many indigenous peoples who built structures or left markers at sacred sites, the Comanche did the opposite. They deliberately obscured these locations, removing signs of human visitation and creating false trails to lead travelers away from them. According to fragments of oral history recorded by ethnographer James Mooney in the 1890s, the Comanche believed that certain places in the Wichita Mountains were thin spots, points where the boundary between the tangible world and the spirit world had worn thin. At these locations, puja was more concentrated, more accessible, but also more dangerous. Only the most experienced medicine men, those who had demonstrated exceptional spiritual discipline, were permitted to visit these sites, and even then only at specific times determined by astronomical conditions. What makes the Comanche's relationship with these sites particularly interesting is their departure from typical indigenous sacred site practices. Most tribes mark and honor their holy places, but the Comanche actively concealed theirs. They spread false stories about the locations, deliberately misled outsiders, and established a complex system of guardianship that involved warriors stationed at a distance to intercept travelers who might accidentally approach these areas. This level of secrecy suggests they were not merely protecting sacred ground, but containing something they perceived as genuinely dangerous. When Lieutenant Randolph Marcy led the first official U.S. military expedition through the Wichita Mountains in 1852, he noted in his report that the Comanche guides became increasingly agitated as they approached the eastern range. They insisted on taking circuitous routes that Marcy, consulting his maps, knew were inefficient. When pressed, the guide spoke of shadow people who walked the narrow valleys after sunset and voices in the stone that could drive men to madness. Marcy, a practical military man, dismissed these as superstitions designed to keep white settlers away from potential mineral deposits. However, he did record in his personal journal, later donated to the University of Texas Archives, that several of his men reported unusually vivid and disturbing dreams while camped near the eastern mountains, dreams of figures watching from the ridgelines and whispering that seemed to come from within the earth itself. One soldier reportedly woke screaming, claiming he had been speaking with his brother who had died years earlier in the Mexican-American War. The soldier insisted it was not a dream, but a visitation, and that his brother had warned him about the old ones who sleep beneath the hills. By the 1850s, as white settlement increased in Indian Territory, reports of strange occurrences in the Wichita Mountains began to appear in regional newspapers and military dispatches. The accounts follow remarkably consistent patterns. Travelers experiencing lost time where hours or days passed without memory, compasses and later watches malfunctioning in specific valleys, the persistent feeling of being observed, and most commonly, encounters with what became known locally as the Watchers, human-like figures seen at a distance who never approached but never fully departed. In 1858, a Methodist circuit preacher named Elijah Harmon documented his experience while traveling through the eastern Wichita Mountains. His account, published in a church newsletter and later preserved in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives, describes becoming lost despite following what he believed was a clear trail. As night fell, he made camp in a small valley. Throughout the night, he wrote, I was plagued by a strange heaviness in the air that made breathing difficult and sleep impossible. Though no fire burned within sight besides my own, I continuously glimpsed what appeared to be the shadows of men moving at the periphery of my vision, always watching, never approaching. Most disturbing was the sensation that time itself flowed differently in that place. The stars seemed fixed in the sky for hours, unmoving, as if the very rotation of the earth had slowed. Harmon reported that when he finally fell asleep near dawn, he experienced a dream so vivid he remained convinced it was no dream at all. In this vision, he was approached by 4 men dressed in the fashion of a much earlier era, clothing of the previous century, as he described it. They spoke to him in unison without moving their lips, telling him he had camped on forbidden ground and must leave immediately. They identified themselves with the same 4 names that would later become associated with the Atwater incident: Jebediah, Solomon, Nathaniel, and Hiram. Harmon awoke to find himself not in the valley where he had made camp, but on an open plain nearly 5 miles away, with no memory of how he had traveled there. His horse was beside him, still saddled but showing signs of exhaustion, as if it had been ridden hard. After the establishment of Fort Sill in 1869, military patrols regularly traversed the Wichita Mountains. The fort's records contained numerous reports of unusual incidents experienced by soldiers in the eastern range. These were typically filed as routine patrol logs, but were later collected and separately archived by Captain Arthur Wells, the fort's intelligence officer from 1872 to 1875, who had developed a personal interest in the phenomena. Wells' collection, now housed in the National Archives, includes over 30 separate accounts of anomalous experiences. One of the most detailed comes from Sergeant Tobias Miller, who led a 6-man patrol through the eastern mountains in October 1873. Miller reported that his unit became inexplicably disoriented despite clear weather and familiar terrain. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered valley. During the night, all 6 men reported hearing what sounded like whispered conversations in an unrecognizable language that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. 3 of the men experienced identical nightmares of figures approaching from the shadows. Most disturbing was their discovery the next morning. Though they had set a standard watch rotation, with each man taking a 2-hour shift, all were convinced they had slept simultaneously for several hours, leaving the camp unguarded. Yet nothing had been disturbed, and their horses showed no signs of anxiety. After the Comanche were confined to reservations in the 1870s, their connection to the Wichita Mountains might have been severed entirely, if not for the efforts of Quanah Parker, the last war chief of the Quahati Band, and later a principal leader of the Comanche in the reservation era. Parker, himself half white, the son of Comanche Chief Peter Nocona and captured settler Cynthia Ann Parker, straddled both worlds and worked to preserve crucial aspects of Comanche culture while adapting to changing circumstances. Historical records indicate that Parker made regular trips to the Wichita Mountains with small groups of trusted warriors and medicine men, journeys that were technically forbidden under reservation restrictions but overlooked by sympathetic Indian agents. According to accounts later provided by his grandson, Edward Parker, in interviews conducted by the University of Oklahoma in the 1950s, these expeditions were not nostalgic returns to hunting grounds, but the continuation of an essential duty maintaining what Quanah called the binding. Edward Parker's account suggests that Quanah believed the binding of shadows ritual performed in 1840 required periodic renewal, particularly during specific celestial alignments. The last documented trip Quanah made to the mountains was in February 1911, just days before his death. He was elderly and in poor health, but insisted on completing the journey despite harsh winter conditions. Upon his return, according to family accounts, he told his wife, "It is finished. The next binding will fall to others in another time." When pressed about what he meant, he reportedly said only, "The 4 remain. They hold the door closed, but nothing holds forever against that which waits behind it." The opening of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in 1901 brought a new dimension to the ongoing mystery. As the area became accessible to researchers, naturalists, and later tourists, reports of unusual phenomena did not diminish, but rather took on new forms. Dr. Franklin Whitehurst, a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey who conducted extensive studies of the mountains between 1901 and 1909, documented magnetic anomalies in specific valleys that defied conventional explanation. In his field journals, preserved at the Smithsonian Institution, he noted that sensitive equipment would malfunction in particular locations, and that some rock formations exhibited unusual properties, including faint but measurable electromagnetic emissions. Whitehurst was a methodical scientist who approached these anomalies with professional skepticism, systematically ruling out known causes such as mineral deposits with high iron content. In a letter to a colleague at Yale University in 1907, he wrote, "Having exhausted conventional explanations, I am left with data that suggests localized distortions in what we understand as natural law. Certain valleys within the eastern range exhibit properties that, were I a man given to fanciful thinking, I might describe as thin places in the fabric of reality. As I am not such a man, I can only acknowledge that our current scientific understanding is insufficient to explain what I have measured and observed." Whitehurst eventually abandoned his research in the Wichita Mountains, citing professional concerns about pursuing a line of inquiry that might damage his scientific reputation. His final field notes contain a curious entry. Camped in the Eastern Valley for 3 nights. Each night dreamt of 4 men who identified themselves as former travelers in this region. They speak in unison and insist they have a message of warning. I find myself reluctant to sleep, knowing they wait in my dreams. As public access to the wildlife refuge increased through the early 20th century, rangers and staff began keeping informal records of unusual visitor experiences. These were not officially documented, but were collected by Ranger Samuel Thornton, who maintained what staff called the Strange File from 1928 to 1952. This collection, now in private hands after being rescued from disposal during an office renovation in the 1960s, contains over 100 handwritten accounts from visitors describing experiences that follow familiar patterns: lost time, disorientation, equipment failures, and sightings of distant figures who vanish when approached. One particularly detailed account comes from Dr. Margaret Wilkins, a botanist who visited the refuge in 1936 to document plant species. While working in an eastern valley, she reported that her compass began spinning continuously and her watch stopped. She experienced what she described as a sudden and profound sense of being in 2 places simultaneously, physically present in the valley but also somewhere else entirely, a place with impossible geometry and light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Most disturbing was her encounter with what she initially thought were park rangers watching from a distant ridge. When she raised her hand to greet them, she realized with sudden clarity that there were exactly 4 figures, all standing unnaturally still. As she watched, they appeared to change position without moving, like viewing a photograph that changes when you look away and back again. Wilkins cut her research trip short and did not return to the refuge. In her final report on the region's flora, she omitted any mention of her experience but included a curious footnote. Certain areas within the eastern range proved inaccessible due to conditions beyond the scope of this study. The Second World War brought a new phase in the Wichita Mountains' strange history. In 1942, as part of the war effort, portions of the eastern range were temporarily closed to the public for what was officially described as military training exercises. However, declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s reveal that the area was being investigated by a specialized unit of the War Department's Intelligence Division, codenamed Project Lantern. The unit was tasked with investigating phenomena that might have military applications, particularly in the emerging field of psychological warfare. What drew their attention to the Wichita Mountains remains partially redacted in the available documents, but unredacted portions reference persistent localized phenomena reported by reliable military personnel and potential applications for disorientation tactics based on environmental factors. The Project Lantern team established a temporary research station in a valley that corresponds to the location associated with the Atwater incident. According to quarterly reports submitted to the War Department, they conducted a series of experiments involving sensitive detection equipment, photographic surveillance, and what they termed personnel exposure protocols, apparently having researchers spend extended periods in locations with reported phenomena. The project's final report, dated November 1943, remains mostly classified, but unredacted portions indicate that the team documented significant anomalies in temporal perception among test subjects and recurrent reports of visual phenomena consistent with previous accounts from the region. Most notably, the report concludes, while no definitive military application has been identified, findings suggest a localized phenomenon of unknown origin with measurable effects on human consciousness. Recommendation: continued classification of all findings and indefinite restriction of public access to test areas. The recommended restrictions were lifted after the war due to public pressure to fully reopen the wildlife refuge, but certain areas remained designated as ecological study zones with limited access. Throughout the Cold War era, the Wichita Mountains continued to generate unusual reports, now filtered through the lens of atomic age anxieties and the emerging UFO phenomenon. Local newspapers occasionally featured stories of strange lights in the eastern range and visitors experiencing missing time, accounts often dismissed as hoaxes or confusion with military activities from nearby Fort Sill. However, a more systematic collection of reports was maintained by Dr. Raymond Carter, a psychology professor at Cameron University in Lawton, who conducted a study of anomalous experiences in natural settings from 1962 to 1968. Carter's research, though framed in psychological terms to maintain academic credibility, effectively documented the continuing phenomena in the mountains. His archive of over 200 interviews with individuals reporting unusual experiences shows remarkable consistency with historical accounts dating back to the Spanish explorers. Subjects repeatedly described sensations of being watched, encountering silent observers at a distance, experiencing distortions in time perception, and having unusually vivid dreams featuring the same 4 male figures. Carter's attempt to publish his findings in mainstream psychological journals was unsuccessful, but his complete records are preserved in Cameron University's special collections. In 1972, the most scientifically credible investigation of the phenomena occurred when Dr. Eleanor Sawyer, a geophysicist with advanced degrees from MIT and extensive experience in field research, led a small team into the eastern mountains to investigate what she hypothesized were naturally occurring electromagnetic anomalies that might explain the historical reports. Equipped with sensitive instruments designed to measure subtle electromagnetic fields, radiation levels, and atmospheric conditions, Sawyer's team spent 3 weeks conducting tests in valleys associated with historical accounts. Their findings, published in the Journal of Anomalous Phenomena, a small but peer-reviewed scientific publication, documented statistically significant electromagnetic anomalies in specific locations. Most notably, they recorded unusual patterns of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic waves that Sawyer noted were remarkably similar to patterns produced by human brain activity during altered states of consciousness. Sawyer's team also experienced equipment failures consistent with historical accounts, compass malfunctions, battery drainages, and irregularities in digital timekeeping devices. Most compelling was their documentation of what Sawyer termed microspatial anomalies, small areas where measured distances would inexplicably vary when remeasured despite using laser rangefinders and other precise equipment. In her conclusion, Sawyer wrote, "While we cannot identify a specific cause for these anomalies, the data strongly suggests localized distortions in electromagnetic fields and possibly in space-time perception itself. These findings warrant further research by specialists in quantum mechanics and consciousness studies." Sawyer planned a follow-up expedition with an expanded team of researchers from diverse scientific backgrounds, but funding was withdrawn shortly before the project was to begin. In a letter to a colleague, later included in her archived papers at MIT, she wrote, "The sudden termination of funding feels less like typical grant politics and more like deliberate suppression. Someone doesn't want these phenomena subjected to rigorous scientific inquiry." Throughout these decades of documented strange occurrences, the Comanche maintained their own relationship with the Wichita Mountains. Though forcibly removed from their traditional territories and subjected to aggressive assimilation policies, they preserved certain knowledge through oral tradition and continued to practice modified versions of traditional ceremonies. According to interviews conducted by anthropologist David White with Comanche elders in the 1980s, archived at the University of Oklahoma, the tribe maintained awareness of their historical responsibility regarding certain sites in the mountains. White's notes record that some elders referred to an ongoing duty called watching the watchers, ensuring that those who had been bound remained bound. This practice apparently involved periodic ceremonial visits to specific locations, conducted quietly and without publicity. The ceremony was described as a renewal of boundaries and involved the burning of specific herbs, offering of tobacco, and recitation of prayers in the Comanche language. One elder, identified only as Joseph in the transcripts, told White, "The old ones made a trade with the four who opened the wrong door, their lives for our safety. They stand at the threshold still, watching what waits behind the door. But they grow tired. Every generation. We must strengthen them with our prayers and remember what they sacrificed." In 1994, a significant development occurred when construction workers expanding a parking area near the refuge's eastern boundary unearthed a small metal container similar to the one found in 1934. Inside were personal items, including a pocket watch, a brass compass, and a small journal. Unlike the earlier discovery, this journal was largely intact and legible. The items were handed over to park authorities and then to the University of Oklahoma for analysis. The journal proved to be written by Hiram Voss, one of Atwater's associates from the 1849 incident. The entries covered only a brief period from February to early March 1840 before the documented strange occurrences began. However, the final entry, dated March 11th, the day before Reed's fateful discovery in the caves, contains a disturbing passage. Reed speaks increasingly of dreams, wherein he is guided to a specific cave in the western slope, claims a voice calls to him by name each night, promising knowledge of great value. I find myself reluctant to sleep of late, as my own dreams are troubled by shadows that stand just beyond the fire's light, watching with patient hunger. Atwater dismisses our concerns as frontier nerves, but I have traveled far wider frontiers than he without experiencing such persistent dread. There is something in these mountains that knows we are here, something that has been waiting. The journal and other items were scheduled for further analysis and eventual public exhibition, but in a disturbing echo of the 1935 incident, a small electrical fire broke out in the university laboratory where they were being stored. The fire was contained quickly and damaged nothing except the specific cabinet containing the artifacts, which were reduced to ashes. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as digital technology became more prevalent, a new pattern emerged in visitor experiences at the wildlife refuge. Digital cameras would malfunction in specific areas, particularly in the eastern valleys. Images taken in these locations often showed unusual artifacts, unexplained light sources, distortions, or in some cases, shadowy figures that were not visible to the photographers at the time. Most of these were dismissed as technical glitches or pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random visual data. However, a systematic analysis conducted by Dr. James Ferris, a computer imaging specialist from the University of Tulsa, identified patterns in these digital anomalies that defied conventional explanation. In a paper published in the Journal of Digital Imaging in 2003, Ferris documented consistent distortion patterns in photographs taken in specific locations, regardless of the equipment used or environmental conditions. Most notably, he identified what he termed algorithmic shadows, areas of digital images that showed evidence of manipulation at the code level, despite being from cameras with no editing capabilities and coming directly from memory cards with no intermediate processing. Ferris concluded, the data suggests that either these specific geographical locations somehow affect digital recording processes at the algorithmic level, or the visual phenomena occurring in these locations interact with digital sensors in ways that current technology cannot properly interpret or record. Either explanation represents a significant anomaly worthy of further investigation. The most recent chapter in this ongoing mystery began in 2010 when the Comanche Nation Cultural Center in Lawton initiated a project to document and preserve traditional knowledge about sacred sites in the Wichita Mountains. Led by cultural preservationist Vanessa Tabanema, the project involved interviewing tribal elders and carefully documenting oral histories that had previously been kept within families or small ceremonial groups. The project encountered significant resistance from some traditional elders who believed certain knowledge should remain unrecorded. According to Tabanema's notes, selectively shared with researchers under tribal supervision, several elders specifically objected to documenting anything related to what they called the binding places in the eastern mountains. One elder reportedly said, "Some knowledge is meant to fade when its purpose is complete. Some doors should remain forgotten." Despite these concerns, the project proceeded with careful protocols established by tribal authorities. However, in 2012, the Cultural Center experienced a server failure that resulted in the loss of all digital records related specifically to the eastern Wichita Mountains. Backup systems failed simultaneously, and even cloud-stored copies were corrupted beyond recovery. Physical notes related to these specific sites were discovered missing from otherwise intact files. The Cultural Center's director, Wilson Werakwe, made no public statement about these losses, but in a private email to Tabanema that was later included in her personal papers, he wrote, "Perhaps this is answer enough about what should be preserved and what should be left to silence. Some boundaries are not meant to be mapped." Today, the eastern valleys of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge remain accessible to visitors, though certain areas are occasionally closed for environmental recovery or research purposes. Park rangers acknowledge the historical reports of strange phenomena, but attribute them to natural causes: unusual acoustic properties of the narrow valleys, magnetic properties of the ancient granite formations, and the psychological effects of isolation in wilderness settings. And yet, the reports continue. Every year, visitors describe experiences that echo those documented for over 150 years: compass malfunctions, sensations of being watched, glimpses of distant figures that vanish when approached, and dreams of four men who speak in unison about doors between worlds and the price of keeping them closed. In 2018, a group of hikers reported becoming inexplicably disoriented in a valley despite clear weather and well-marked trails. They described experiencing a heavy stillness in the air and the sensation that time was passing differently. Most disturbing was their shared experience of seeing four men standing on a distant ridge, watching us without moving. When they attempted to approach or photograph these figures, they could no longer locate them. The hikers' phones and GPS devices malfunctioned simultaneously, and they ultimately had to be guided out of the area by park rangers after spending several hours walking in circles despite following what they believed was a straight path. The rangers' official report attributed the incident to environmental disorientation and group suggestion, but privately, one ranger admitted to the group's leader that similar reports were not uncommon in that specific area. The Comanche Nation maintains its own relationship with the Wichita Mountains. While much of their public cultural preservation focuses on well-documented aspects of their history, horsemanship, buffalo hunting, and trading practices, there remains a quiet, largely unacknowledged tradition related to the eastern mountains. According to individuals familiar with tribal practices, but speaking on condition of anonymity, small groups of Comanche spiritual leaders still make occasional visits to specific sites, conducting ceremonies that connect to the events of 1840. These ceremonies are not publicized or explained to outsiders, but are described as maintaining boundaries and honoring the watchers. And so, the mystery of the Wichita Mountains continues, documented across centuries yet never fully explained, investigated by scientists, yet resistant to conclusive analysis, known to the Comanche yet honored largely through silence. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this prolonged enigma is not any single incident or report, but the consistent patterns that emerge across time, technology, and cultural perspective. From Spanish explorers to modern hikers, from Comanche warriors to university researchers, the experiences follow the same essential contours: distortions in time perception, sensations of being observed, encounters with four watching figures, and dreams or visions of boundaries between worlds that must be maintained. Is there something in those ancient granite peaks that truly defies our understanding of reality? Did Jebediah Atwater and his men stumble upon forces beyond human comprehension? And did the Comanche, with their deep spiritual connection to the land, perform a ritual that somehow contained these forces at great cost? A binding that incorporated the very men who had broken the original seal? The historical record offers no definitive answers, only a persistent, unsettling pattern of experiences that continues to the present day. But even now, visitors to certain valleys in the eastern range occasionally report a strange heaviness in the air, a quality of silence unlike any natural quiet, and the persistent feeling of being watched from all directions at once. Some claim to see four distant figures standing motionless on ridgelines or among rocks, figures that vanish when directly approached or observed. And a few spending the night in these valleys, despite ranger warnings about difficult terrain, report dreams of four men who speak in unison about doors between worlds and the price of keeping them closed. Their message, consistent across more than 150 years of documented accounts, remains unchanged. We watch, we contain, we endure. Enigma. Perhaps White Wolf's words to that Smithsonian researcher in 1898 remain the most appropriate response to this enduring mystery. Some doors must remain closed. Some stories must remain untold. The binding holds, but only if we honor it with silence. And yet, the wind still carries whispers across the plains of southwestern Oklahoma. In the shadow of those ancient mountains, something waits. Something watches, something remembers.